It's the hour before dawn on March 1st, 1896, on a mountainside above the market town of Adwa, in northern Ethiopia. An Italian brigade commander, named Matteo Albertoni, checks the peak in front of him against the map in his hand. The map says this is Kidani Meret, the position his orders tell him to hold before sunrise. A scout tells him he's wrong. He's on the wrong mountain, cut off from the rest of his army by miles of broken ground, marching straight toward the largest army most of his soldiers have ever seen in their lives. By early afternoon, that army, sent by one of Europe's newest colonial powers, ready to fold Ethiopia into an empire it had already built along the Red Sea coast, will be gone as a fighting force. One of the most complete defeats any European army suffered anywhere in the 19th century. It will end with an Italian prime minister out of a job within the month, and a treaty in which Italy puts its own signature under two words it had spent 7 years trying to avoid: Ethiopian independence. Told quickly, this sounds like a fluke. Spears against rifles, a wrong turn on a foggy morning, a lucky day for the side playing defense. The map really was wrong, but everything the map was wrong about, the guns waiting on the other side of that mountain, the fact that Ethiopia could field an army capable of winning this fight at all, took a decade of diplomacy and arms deals to build. Every date, figure, and quote in this video comes from treaty texts, contemporary battle records, and named historians, sourced in full at the end. Not the shorthand version, where Ethiopia just gets lucky. This is how an emperor most of Europe had never heard of out-armed, out-planned, and out-fought a European power that was certain it couldn't lose. To understand why Italy needed this fight so badly, you have to understand what kind of country Italy still was in the 1880s. Unified only since 1861, poor, and desperate to be treated as a great power by neighbors who'd been running empires for centuries. The Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885 had just carved up the African continent among European governments, and Italy, arriving late to the table, grabbed what was left. A strip of Red Sea coastline that would become the colony of Eritrea. Prime Minister Francesco Crispi wanted more than a colony. He wanted proof that Italy belonged in the same conversation as Britain and France. Ethiopia, the largest independent state left on the continent, was the obvious next target. Italy had already tried once and failed. In January 1887, at a village called Dogali, an Ethiopian force under the general Rasulula Ngida destroyed an Italian column and killed roughly 500 of its soldiers in a single morning. Rome treated it as an aberration rather than a warning, poured more money and more soldiers into the region, and 2 years later signed a treaty in the town of Wukali, hoping to accomplish through a signature what it hadn't managed with soldiers. That treaty is where this story actually starts. In May 1889, Menelik had just become emperor. He signed a friendship and trade agreement with Italy's representative, Count Pietro Antonelli. Ethiopia ceded a strip of highland territory near the coast, land that would become part of Italian Eritrea. In exchange, Italy promised money, weapons, and recognition. Buried near the end of the document was Article 17, a routine-looking clause about how Ethiopia would handle its foreign relations. Routine, except the treaty existed in 2 languages, and the 2 versions didn't say the same thing. The Amharic text gave Menelik the option of using Italy's government to communicate with other foreign powers, if he chose to. The Italian text made it mandatory. One version described a courtesy, the other described a protectorate. Menelik didn't find out which version Italy intended to use until other European governments started writing back to him with the same message. Talk to Rome first. Italy had circulated the Italian text to the courts of Europe, informing them that Ethiopia's foreign policy now ran through Italian hands. Menelik denounced the treaty outright in 1893, telling Italy in writing that he considered it void. On paper, that solved nothing. Denouncing a treaty is a sentence. Backing it up is an army, and in 1889, when he signed his name at Wuchali, Ethiopia didn't have one built for a war against a European power. What Menelik had by 1895 was different, and that difference is the part of this story that usually gets left out. Menelik hadn't spent his life waiting for a treaty dispute to test him. In 1855, when he was 11, his father, the king of the central province of Shewa, was killed in battle, and the boy was taken captive by a rival emperor, Tewodros II, who held him for 10 years at a mountain fortress called Magdala. He escaped in 1865 and reclaimed his father's throne. For the next 2 decades, while a more senior emperor, Johannes IV, ruled the empire from the north, Menelik built his own power to the south and east, absorbing the regions of Harar, Jimma, and Kaffa, while formally deferring to Johannes as his overlord. He installed his cousin, Ras Makonnen, as governor of Harar, a decision that would matter twice over. Makonnen would go on to command Ethiopian forces at both Amba Alagi and Adwa, and his own son, born in that same city, would one day rule Ethiopia as Emperor Haile Selassie. It was patient work, years of it, and it meant that when Johannes was killed fighting modest forces from Sudan in March 1889, Menelik was already the strongest ruler in the country. He became emperor within days. He used the years that followed to do something almost no other African ruler facing European expansion managed. He armed his empire on his own terms, using European rivalries against each other. Russia, bound to Ethiopia by a shared Orthodox Christian faith, supplied burden rifles. France, eager to check Italian ambitions in the region, supplied Gras rifles through its own colonial port in Djibouti. Even Italy, in the years before the relationship soured completely, sold Menelik weapons under the terms of the Wutale Treaty itself. In 1890, Ethiopia was formally included in an international agreement regulating the African arms trade, sponsored, ironically, by Italy, which was trying to control who could buy weapons on the continent. Instead, it gave Menelik's existing purchases a legal cover they hadn't had before. By 1895, for the first time, Ethiopia was equipped to fight a European power and actually win. Rifles in a storehouse don't fight wars. People do, and in September 1895, Menelik needed to know how many people were willing to fight this one. He issued a proclamation, an awaj, carried by messengers to every province of the empire. The Library of Congress holds a translation of it in its Ethiopian collection. An enemy, it warned, had come to destroy the homeland and change the religion of its people. Deliberately, the proclamation didn't specify whose religion. Ethiopia was Christian and Muslim both, and Menelik needed both communities in the field. The response, historians agree, arrived within weeks. Tens of thousands of fighters converging on the capital from provinces that had spent decades fighting each other over territory, now marching under one emperor toward one war. They didn't wait until Adwa to prove they could win. In December 1895, at a mountain position called Amba Alagi, Ras Makonnen, Menelik's cousin and one of his most trusted generals, led an assault that overran an Italian garrison under Major Pietro Toselli was killed, and his garrison suffered heavy losses. A month later, an Italian garrison of just over 1,300 men, most of them Eritrean askari under Major Giuseppe Galliano, found itself surrounded inside a half-built fort at Mekelle by an Ethiopian force many times its size. Empress Taytu, Menelik's wife and closest advisor, is credited by multiple historians with the tactic that broke the siege, cutting off the fort's water supply. 10 days later, with no water left, the garrison surrendered rather than die of thirst. Menelik let them walk out under their own flag. His stated reason, recorded by the historian Richard Kalk, was simple: to give proof of my Christian faith. In Rome, 2 defeats in 2 months should have forced a pause. Instead, Prime Minister Crispy, humiliated in Parliament and desperate for a victory to point to, pushed his general in the field to attack before he was ready. That general's name was Oreste Baratieri. The choice he made over the next 3 days decided everything that followed. Menelik's approach to the whole standoff was patience. He never marched north to attack Italian positions in Eritrea directly. He let his army gather on ground of his own choosing, in territory his soldiers knew, and Italy's didn't, and let Baratieri's own supply lines and political pressure do a share of the work for him. Every week Baratieri waited was a week further from his coastal supply base. Every week Menelik waited was a week closer to more of his own reinforcements arriving. The positioning in the weeks beforehand decided most of what happened on the morning of March 1st. By late February 1896, both armies were starving. In different ways, Baratieri had brought somewhere between 14 and 18,000 men into Ethiopia, a fraction of the force he was about to face. Menelik's side, likely somewhere between 70,000 and over 100,000, depending on which historian you trust, had been living off a stretch of highland already stripped bare by months of foraging. Baratieri knew it. He'd told his own government that if he simply waited, Menelik's army would begin to melt away on its own, provincial fighters drifting home to bring in the harvest. Waiting, though, wasn't an option Rome was willing to fund any longer. On February 28th, Crispi sent a telegram accusing Baratieri of running a war through diplomacy instead of arms. That night, Baratieri met with his 4 brigade commanders. He raised the idea of retreating toward Asmara. Every one of them argued for attacking instead. General Vittorio da Bormida reportedly told him Italy would rather lose 2,000 or 3,000 men than retreat without a fight. Baratieri, against his own judgment, gave the order to advance. The plan called for 3 brigades to march through the night and take up position on 3 separate mountains by dawn, close enough to support each other with covering fire if the fighting started. It was a plan built on maps drawn from limited reconnaissance, in terrain none of the Italian commanders had walked before in the dark. Almost immediately, it fell apart. The brigades lost contact with each other on narrow tracks through broken country. By the time the sun came up on March 1st, they were scattered across miles of mountainside instead of standing shoulder to shoulder. Matteo Albertoni's brigade, made up mostly of Eritrean Askari soldiers under Italian officers, reached the wrong peak first and kept marching even after a scout warned him. He walked directly into the position held by Ras Alula Ngida, the same commander who'd destroyed an Italian column at Dogali 9 years earlier, and the battle began around 6 in the morning, hours before Baratieri intended. On the Ethiopian side, the army had already taken its positions overnight, under Menelik's own order. Negus Tekle Haymanat commanded the right. Ras Alula held the left. Ras Makonnen and Ras Mengesha anchored the center. Ras Mikhael led Oromo cavalry on the flank. The Emperor and Empress Taytu stayed with the reserve. Albertone's men fought for 2 hours, at first with an artillery advantage that cost the Ethiopians dearly, until a commander named Balcha Safo dragged Ethiopian quick-firing guns onto lower ground and matched them gun for gun. Outnumbered by a margin no officer trains for, Albertone's brigade broke. Albertone himself was captured. His survivors fell back into General Giuseppe Arimondi's brigade, which held for roughly 3 more hours before it too was overrun. Arimondi was killed rallying his line. That left General da Bormida, the man who'd argued so hard against retreat 2 nights earlier, cut off on the army's right flank, with no idea the rest of the battle had already collapsed. Trying to find his way back to the main force, he led his brigade into a narrow valley. Ethiopian cavalry closed both ends of it. Da Bormida was killed there, and accounts differ on whether his body was ever recovered. 2 of Baratieri's 4 brigade commanders were dead within hours. A third, Albertone, was a prisoner. Only General Giuseppe Alina, whose brigade had been held back in reserve, led his men out of the fighting intact. By early afternoon, it was over. What had marched out that night as an Italian army was now a scattered retreat back toward Eritrea, leaving its artillery, thousands of rifles, and its dead across a mountainside it had never successfully mapped. The fighting was over by early afternoon. Sorting out what it had cost took much longer, and the honest answer isn't a clean one. Historians still argue over the precise numbers, and estimates vary widely, partly because both armies were trying to keep records in the middle of a rout. The middle of the range looks something like this. Somewhere around 6,000 to 7,000 Italian and Eritrean dead, several thousand more taken prisoner, against Ethiopian losses also counted in the thousands. Even at the low end of any of these estimates, it remains one of the worst single-day defeats a European army suffered anywhere in the entire colonial era. The retreating Italians left behind their field artillery, and, by most accounts, something like 11,000 rifles. What happened to the prisoners afterward complicates any version of this story that wants a clean ending. Most Italian captives were held and eventually released, treated reasonably well given the circumstances, by most accounts. The roughly 2,000 Eritrean Askari captured, Africans who had fought inside Italy's colonial army, were not extended the same treatment. Regarded as traitors for fighting alongside the colonizer against a fellow African power, around 800 of them had a hand and a foot amputated as punishment. Multiple independent sources report that Menelik himself opposed the practice, and that he was pressured into allowing it by figures around him, including Empress Taytu, the head of the Ethiopian church, and the Tigrayan leader Rasmengesha Yohannes. It's a brutal footnote inside a story that usually gets told as a clean triumph. Leaving it out would be a lie by omission. In Rome, the reaction was immediate. News of the defeat triggered riots in multiple Italian cities. Within weeks, Crispi, the prime minister who had pushed for this war and pressured Baratieri into fighting it before he was ready, resigned under a parliamentary vote of censure. Baratieri himself was court-martialed. He was acquitted, but his career in the army was finished. That October, in Addis Ababa, Italy signed the treaty it had spent 7 years trying to avoid. The Treaty of Addis Ababa abrogated Wuchale outright and recognized Ethiopia's independence, unconditionally, in writing. It meant Ethiopia could now send its own ambassadors to European capitals directly, the very right Italy had spent 7 years insisting didn't exist. The argument that started with one mistranslated verb in Article 17 ended with that verb erased entirely. For the first time since the scramble for Africa began, a European power had gone to war to claim an African state, and lost so completely that it put its own signature on the opposite outcome. Before Adwa, European governments had built their entire justification for colonial expansion on one assumption: that modern rifles and artillery made African resistance a matter of when, not if. Both sides at Adwa fought with modern breech-loading rifles and field artillery, and Ethiopia won because it had more of both than Italy expected, positioned by commanders who knew the ground, backed by a population that had chosen, deliberately, to fight. There's no version of the casualty numbers, however you total them, that makes this look like anything but a clean, decisive Ethiopian victory. And that fact traveled. A treaty signed in a palace in Addis Ababa shouldn't have mattered much beyond Ethiopia's own borders. It did, and fast. Word of Adwa moved by cable and by ship, and black communities across the Americas, the Caribbean, and Europe treated it as proof of something the previous decade of colonial expansion had been built to deny: that African armies, African governments, and African sovereignty could stand against European power and win. A religious and political current called Ethiopianism, which had already begun using Ethiopia as a symbol of black dignity and self-rule, gained real momentum after Adwa. The first formal Pan-African conference convened in London in 1900, just 4 years later, at a time when Ethiopia was still the clearest example anyone could point to of an African government that had faced a European army and won outright. Marcus Garvey, building the Pan-Africanist movement in the decades that followed, invoked Ethiopia's example directly. When independent African nations founded the Organization of African Unity in 1963, they chose to headquarter it in Addis Ababa, in the country that had already shown the rest of the continent what refusing colonization actually looked like in practice. Ethiopia spent the next 4 decades as one of only 2 African nations that could say they had never been formally colonized, the other being Liberia, whose independence had been shaped by the United States rather than won on a battlefield. Ethiopia's own independence held until 1935, when Mussolini's fascist government invaded again, using chemical weapons and a level of firepower the 1896 army never faced. Rome finally got the empire it wanted, and kept it for 5 years, before losing it in the Second World War. That later occupation is a different story. It took Mussolini's entire modern military, 39 years later, to accomplish what Baratieri's army couldn't manage in one poorly planned night. Go back to that mountainside above Adwa, to Matteo Albertone checking his map in the dark. His mistake mattered because of what was waiting for him on the other side of it. An army that had rifles because Menelik played France and Russia against Italy for a decade, that had numbers because a mobilization proclamation convinced Christians and Muslims alike this was worth fighting for, that had already beaten Italy twice before this battle even started. Take away any one piece of that preparation, and the wrong turn on a foggy morning is just a wrong turn. Rome finds its footing, reinforces, and tries again. Instead, one government's decade of unglamorous, deliberate preparation met one empire's rushed, badly mapped ambition, and only one of them was actually ready for what came next. Rasulullah, the general who'd handed Italy its first warning at Dogali in 1887, was still on the field 9 years later when Albertone stumbled into his position. Rome had 9 years to learn the lesson he was teaching. It didn't. Ethiopia stayed independent for the rest of the colonial era, on the strength of what happened that morning, and the rest of the continent noticed. In Ethiopia today, March 1st, Adwa's anniversary, is still marked as a national holiday, 130 years after the battle itself. If this kind of history, the kind built from treaty texts and battle records instead of the shorthand version, is what keeps you watching, African Chapter has more of it every week. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.